Studio microphone. In this lesson, we are going to learn about authentication in LLM APIs. When our application connects to an AI service, such as OpenAI, Gemini, or Claude, the API needs to know who is making the request. It also needs to make sure that the application is allowed to use the service. This process is called authentication. Authentication helps protect AI services from unauthorized access and misuse. Usually, an application proves its identity using a secret credential, such as an API key. Throughout this lesson, we will learn how authentication works, how API keys are used, and most importantly, how to keep those API keys safe and secure. Why do APIs need authentication? Imagine an AI API that anyone could access without any security. People could send unlimited requests, use the service without permission, and even create unexpected costs for the API owner. This could also lead to abuse and other security problems. Authentication creates a security barrier between users and the AI service. It verifies the credentials before allowing a request to continue. If the credentials are valid, the request can access the API. If they are not valid, the request is rejected. So authentication helps keep LLM APIs secure, controlled, and protected. Now let's understand the basic authentication flow. First, your application sends a request to the LLM API. Along with the request, it also sends its authentication credentials. The API receives these credentials and checks whether they are valid. If the credentials are valid, the request is accepted, and the AI service continues processing it. But if the credentials are invalid or missing, the API rejects the request. So before an application can use an LLM API, it must first prove that it is authorized to access the service. Now let's understand what an API key is. An API key is a secret credential used by an application when connecting to an API. You can think of it like a digital key. Your application sends this key with its request, and the API uses it to identify and authenticate the application. If the key is valid, the application can access the service. Because an API key provides access to your account, it should always be treated like a password. Never share it publicly, and always keep it safe and secure. Now let's look at how you can get an API key. First, create an account with your AI provider. Next, open the provider's developer or API console and create a project, if required. Then, generate a new API key or credential. Once the key is created, store it in a secure location. Your application can then use this credential to authenticate when connecting to the AI service. Remember, your API key is a secret. Never share it publicly or include it in public source code. Now let's see how authentication is included in an HTTP request. When your application calls an LLM API, the request contains several important parts. It includes the API endpoint, the HTTP method, such as POST, the HTTP headers, the authentication credential, and the JSON request body. The authentication credential is commonly sent inside an HTTP header. When the API receives the request, it checks this credential first. If the credential is valid, the API accepts the request and continues processing the JSON data. So authentication is an important part of every secure LLM API request. Now let's understand the term bearer token. When working with APIs, you may see an authorization header that starts with the word bearer. A bearer token is a credential that gives access to a protected API. The application sends this token with the request, and the API checks whether the token is valid. If it is valid, the request can continue to the protected service. The important thing to remember is, anyone who obtains your bearer token may be able to use it. That's why bearer tokens must always be kept private and secure. Now let's compare successful and failed authentication. When your application sends a valid credential, the API verifies it and allows the request to continue. The LLM can then process the request and generate a response. But if the credential is missing, invalid, expired, or revoked, authentication fails. The API rejects the request and may return an error such as 401, unauthorized. So remember, valid credentials allow access, while invalid credentials cause the request to be rejected. Now let's understand the difference between authentication and authorization. These two terms are related, but they have different meanings. Authentication checks who you are. It verifies your credentials, such as an API key or access token. Once your identity is verified, authorization determines what you are allowed to do. For example, your application may be authenticated successfully, but it may not have permission to access a particular AI model or feature. So remember this simple difference. Authentication asks, "Who are you?" and authorization asks, "What are you allowed to access?"